Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever in the world that you are joining us. My name is Ali Hirji, and you know me as the lead for AI and cybersecurity at Durham College, as well as the host of this Power Hour show. And today we're going to be diving into a topic where I've often said that if you want to define the future, you need to study the past. And we're going to be going through some details over the last 2 quarters, or maybe just the last quarter, to tell us a little bit about what we've learned from the attacks, what we've learned from the responses to these attacks, and how you can better position yourself and your cybersecurity posture. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you live from the beautiful city of Oshawa in Durham region. And more importantly, I recognize the indigenous ancestry of this land. And I also welcome those who are joining in virtually and remind them that the virtual space as well constitutes indigenous space. Our fiber optic cables, our wireless connections, all run across this land and sky. Forewarned is forearmed. And today, we're going to forewarn you about certain threats that we've not only seen, but that could be coming as we go into the holiday season and as we go into 2022. The company that I'm going to be engaging with today in the Power Hour is in very little need of an introduction. I'd argue that if you're in North America, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Australia, across Europe for that matter, I'd argue you're about a millisecond away from one of their nodes. About 90% of the traffic in the areas that we're in right now typically run across a Cloudflare network. They serve close to, I would argue, 28 million HTTP requests per second. And one of the benefits of being so close to the internet is they can now tell you what they've seen and what you need to prepare for. You all figured it out. I am speaking about Cloudflare, and I want to thank them for sponsoring the session and making it happen. And without further ado, I'm going to welcome my guest and have him introduce himself. Patrick, welcome to my Power Hour show. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you and the team from Cloudflare. Tell us a little bit about what you do, your role at Cloudflare, and what makes it so particularly exciting. Patrick.
Terrific. Thanks for hosting me, Ali, and welcome to everyone listening at home. As Ali mentioned, my name is Patrick Donahue, and I'm the Director of Product Management at Cloudflare for security products, which means I manage product managers that are building solutions to help protect your networks and your corporate employees. I've been at the company about 7 years. Seems to have gone by quite quickly. I was a customer previously. For those that don't know Cloudflare, our mission is to help build a better internet. So we built one of the biggest networks in the world, and we let businesses and individuals connect to it to secure their online presence. Our mission is really a global secure network you can plug into and be protected from threats and also acceleration of that traffic. What I'm most excited about is frankly, all the data and requests that are traversing our network. You mentioned that 28 million requests per second. We help secure some of the largest companies in the world, about 20% of the Fortune 1000. But what I really enjoy is that long tail of the individual blogs and the small sites that use us. We provide a really great free solution for them or a very low cost solution, but that data actually helps inform the protections and arms the security products, if you will, that we sell to our larger customers. And so really excited about that mission to help make the internet better more broadly.
Fantastic, Patrick. And, I often say this, that I like to use my own brains. There is a brain somewhere in me, I guarantee you, but I also enjoy borrowing all the brains that I can find. And in terms of analyzing the reports from the last quarter, I couldn't think of an individual more better than yourself to engage in this discussion. Also, Patrick, I thought you were coming in from the most European city in America, San Francisco, but you're not. You're coming in from Austin, Texas. So thank you for making the time. And again, a shout out to the team at Cloudflare, as well as the team at Cyber Exchange, for making these global connections happen. Let's jump into some of the details that you've shared with me, Patrick. The topic for the session is to look at the threats that you're seeing across the Cloudflare ecosystem and across the different clients and the different sectors that you service. Now, of course, you can't talk Cloudflare without talking CDN, but also without talking DDoS. I can tell you this, that in the Durham region, whenever we assist, especially at the college, when we assist small businesses with taking on building new applications, one of our first suggestions to them is you need to have Cloudflare at the front end, understanding and drawing out for them the CDN architecture. But I want our audience to understand what's changing from a DDoS perspective. If I remember the numbers right, attack packets have increased by about 224%, the bytes by about 138%, or if not more than that. There's a steady increase in not just the size, but the types of DDoS attacks that you're seeing since 2020. So let's tackle the first question first. Why are you seeing such an incremental, catastrophic increase in the attacks that come from a DDoS perspective? Patrick?
Great question. And, I think part of it at the end of the day is just math and looking at sort of the evolution of networks and the internet at large. And this is a timely topic we just wrote about in our blog. We blocked a 2 terabit per second attack a couple of weeks ago, which, when you told me when I started and I was managing DDoS, that would be unfathomable. And from a size perspective, I think a lot of it has to do with just more devices out there, in particular IoT devices. Oftentimes, to keep costs down, these are very insecure devices that get pushed to the field quickly, not protected, are susceptible to being commandeered and used in a botnet. But also the devices that we're seeing as of late are actually more powerful. And so if you think about 5 years ago, you had the Mirai botnet, that was really these low powered devices, and they weren't able to generate too much attack traffic from a request per second basis. And so if you think about DDoS, there's really 2 ways to think about it. There's sending just a whole bunch of traffic from a byte perspective, right? And that's really a solved problem. If you have a big enough, distributed enough network, and we have a network of 250 cities around the world, you can kind of just be bigger than the attack, right? And obviously you need to do some smart analysis of what to drop and what not to drop. But the more concerning trends we've seen lately are really around the request per second, right? So actually being able to generate an HTTP request, and really that's what's changed as of late. And so we wrote about recently a botnet known as Maris. There's the Cloudflare Radar site has a nice deep dive on that. Maris is actually a botnet comprised of these MikroTik home routers. And so what's interesting about that is they've got more CPU at their disposal, and they're taking advantage of techniques like HTTP pipelining. And so if you can keep a connection open and send a lot of web requests that you actually have to terminate at the TLS layer, decrypt the request, inspect it, and then figure out not just at the network layer, this is going to go to TCP 443 or these days QUIC. If you actually have to unwrap it and look at it, that's harder to defend against. And so you see when these sorts of devices are taken over, the attacks really get more difficult. I think beyond that, you're just seeing a growth in bandwidth, right? So as you mentioned, I'm no longer in San Francisco, but my home internet is gigabit. And so if somebody were able to take over, my device, they'd be able to commandeer a lot more, data sent, on the egress path from my home network. And then lastly, in addition to the home devices that are being taken over, you see vulnerabilities in servers that are extremely well connected. And so there was a GitLab vulnerability you probably heard about in the last couple of weeks in actually an EXIF library, and that was taken over and used to send from very well connected machines.
I want to work with that just a little bit, because you've touched not only on the fact that there's the network and application layer when it comes to DDoS attacks, but there are other layers as well. You mentioned the TLS handshake, for example. And there was a question, and I will just bifurcate just for a moment to the audience. I've got a couple of questions that have been direct messaged to me. To the rest of you that are on, please feel free to drop the questions in the live chat. And I've been set up pretty nicely by the CyberX team here. I'll bring those questions as we go along. So one of the questions that came in from George and this was direct message to me, where he asked, can you talk a little bit about, we mentioned this earlier, the size and type of attacks? Can you help us understand, are you seeing more attacks that are going at the application layer, or are you seeing things happening at the TLS handshake? And more importantly, your data was also pointing to a significant, and this is a significant number of attacks that are now targeting VoIP-based devices and SIP trunking, so on and so forth. So can you comment a little bit about the size, type, and why VoIP and SIP services that are being exclusively attacked?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. I think from a size and type perspective, I mean, you think about the DNS, amplification, where you're spoofing a source address and trying to get a response sent back, UDP, which doesn't require a handshake. So those are your sort of traditional, SYN floods, ACK floods, your traditional kind of network layer attacks at TCP as well. Those are, for the most part, we're able to identify and block those. I think where it gets interesting and where we spend our time these days is the ones that are emulating specific protocols. And I'll talk about why in a second. You mentioned VoIP. But when you emulate a business protocol, whether it's VoIP or in financial services, maybe it's fixed if that's public facing. Again, similar to like making an HTTP request, you actually have to get down and unwrap and try to figure out, is this a legitimate, in the VoIP world, SIP packet or SRTP or RTP or whatever the particular protocol is. And so it makes the detection and mitigation harder. From a why they're going after these types, and it's VoIP and video now. Previously, we saw energy companies getting attacked, financial services, healthcare. Really, that's where on those formers, that's where the dollars are, right? So a lot of these are ransomware attacks that are coming in. And so there's some sort of advanced notification sent saying, hey, if you don't pay this much Bitcoin by this particular date, we're going to take your network offline, right? And so cryptocurrency has really made it easier for attackers to extract dollars and harder for authorities to track the flow of payments. And so when you think about that financial incentive to leverage these attacks, coupled with cryptocurrencies, that's really increased. We get, I think, on several per day at least that reach out to us that are under attack. Some of them ransom, some of them not, to quickly onboard and help us protect them. If you think about, to go to the VoIP angle for a second, if you think about why that's problematic, if you're going after a site that does file downloads, for example, you don't really care if the download's a little bit slower, or maybe you have to retry it. But if you and I are on a forum like this and speaking in real time, if the network that's carrying this traffic gets attacked and all of a sudden you're only catching every other word, or it's delayed and showing up later, that's a problem, right, for those real-time applications. And so I think what attackers are doing and seeing is there's, again, incentive and easier disruption of some of these real-time communication protocols. And so we've seen a big shift over the last month. We've been helping a lot of these voice and video companies, and some of them have written about this or discussed it publicly, but we've been helping them get back online and stay online and keep communications up for their customers.
Very, very important, because I think, you've talked about the sophistication of the attacks, but also the intent of the attack. And often, we might look at it as just trying to extract financial value directly, but there's the indirect impact as well. I mean, we've heard quite a bit about Zoom bombing, which tends to be more on the social engineering side. But when you look at these very, very critical and technical moments where DDoS attacks are applied, it brings down the quality of service. And once that QoS goes down, reliability, et cetera, consistency of a service, all gets impacted. So Patrick, thank you for bringing that up. Patrick, I'm going to stay on this. I know our scripts sort of was going to take us down the bot routes, and I see some questions have come in already about IP ranges. So hold on to them. Eileen, I see your question. I see a couple of others. Keep them coming, direct message or live chat. We're going to stay on this topic of VoIP and the types and sizes of attacks. There's a question that's come in which talks about response. Now, Cloudflare, especially in my own uses of it, has always been an advocate of a positive security approach. And in the event that you have a client that has suffered a pretty sophisticated DDoS attack and is now seeing ransomware nodes popping up across their network and across different nodes, how does Cloudflare get involved? And can you share some experiences of how you've helped clients with coming through some of these terrains which are laced with nails and thorns?
Sure, and it's been a fun few years. I mean, if you think about where we came from, we were very much in the reverse proxy space, where we would do CDN and DDoS and web application firewall, predominantly at the HTTP layer. Although we would defend against network attacks if they were hitting our IP addresses. Where we've moved since 2019 is taking customers' own IP ranges. And so if you have your own IP prefix, at minimum /24, and you're announcing that at your edge from your routers, that is susceptible, because that typically goes directly to you. And so that's been a lot of our focus and a lot of the, I'd say, fun war stories over the last couple of years of how we've been able to onboard those networks to our network and essentially announce them from our data centers around the world, and then drop those attacks at the edge. And so if you think about what those attacks look like, a ransomware note will come in, and often they'll demonstrate some sort of, the power of the attack, and they'll disrupt something temporarily. And then there's this kind of this race, if you will, to bring a network behind the protection and implement that positive security model you mentioned. The easiest thing, of course, is just to say, let's drop anything that's not from, our partners, or if it's targeting a certain destination, IP, let's drop stuff from people that, we don't want to receive traffic from. That's obviously a lot harder if you're on something like this, like a video conference where anybody can dial in. And so to the extent that you can put positive security models in place, it really differs based on the type of application, the type of workload you're running. I think one of my favorite onboarding stories, and this is the early days of a product we call Magic Transit, which is our network layer DDoS protection. Was fall of 2019. I was in London. I was working out of our London office, and a peer of mine who manages our networking and performance calls me. I think it's 3 or 4 in the morning there, and I think he had to call me 3 or 4 times to wake me up. I managed the DDoS side of it, the security side of that network product. And we actually onboarded, this was Wikipedia. Wikipedia was under attack, and we've talked about this and written about this. But in the early days, getting an entire network onboarded was a much more manual process. And really the result of just such an influx of these ransom attacks has forced us to accelerate that process. And so at the time, it took us a couple days to fully onboard them, and we were like, wow, that's really slow. And now we're doing things where somebody will call us under attack, and same day in some cases we're onboarding them. And so really that's been a necessity based on just the frequency of these attacks we're seeing.
Very good. And there have a few more questions that have come in on this subject, and one that I expected to come that also talks about attacks on the Cloudflare edges themselves. And we'll come to that somewhat towards the end when we start to summate the conversation. I'm going to not necessarily change away and start talking to, because I know there are quite a few folks who are online who work in the artificial intelligence space, folks who actually create bots, but for good. But I'm sure that they have a lot to share from a botnet perspective, and I see their questions coming in. Patrick, I want to stay on the DDoS path just for a little bit more. You mentioned the word speed and frequency very often. And one of the things that I've often reminded a lot of security teams that I train these days, and when I advocate for Cloudflare as well, as I talk about today, in security, it's not about who can learn and learn the most. It's about who can learn and learn the fastest, and start to create your proactive defenses as you learn quickly. Can you tell us a little bit, we're seeing speed of attacks. In some cases, I think one of your data points suggests 17.2 million RPS for some of these attacks. What is contributing to this excessive speed and things that we're seeing? Is it exclusively that you're seeing IoT, Internet of Threats? Are you seeing Internet of Things devices being taken over more? Or how exactly are bad actors able to generate such level and speed of attacks?
Great question, and I think it goes back to some of the points I made earlier around insecure devices or applications that are on well-connected machines being compromised. If you can take advantage of something, oftentimes that's recruited into a botnet of tens of thousands of devices and pointed somewhere. In some cases, these are from residential ISPs they're behind, right? So it may be a device in your home that it's easy enough to block, problematic autonomous systems and IP ranges that are, known bad actors, but it's much more difficult when there are devices in the home, and you don't want to, as a network, you don't want to drop AT&T or Google Fiber or Comcast or whatever the ISPs you have up in Canada, because then you're going to have a lot of false positives, and customers are going to be upset when they can't go buy stuff online and they can't make legitimate transactions. And so I think the thing to go back to your point on the having a plan and being ready for those attacks is, if you get a ransomware notice, we're strongly advising customers, do not pay it, contact your local authorities, reach out, we're here to help, and really just have a plan in place. And I would expect at some point it's going to come your way, hopefully not, but it's always good to drill that in advance and be ready for it.
I definitely saw this question coming, and more interest on VoIP and SIP services. Questions coming from John and Patrick. I do want to move to the botnet subject very, very closely, ironically, because today I'm teaching a class about developing your own bots using some simple tools like Dialogflow. So I feel very much under pressure over here, but I have to come to botnets very shortly. But John, because I'm such a kind man, I will take your question and stay on the topic of VoIP and SIP services. And Patrick, I'm going to read this for you verbatim. Okay. John says, you mentioned VoIP and SIP services being targeted even harder these days. Sure, as an enterprise security lead, I am responsible for my infrastructure. But how do you recommend I evaluate the DDoS mitigation strategies within my service providers? You referenced Chromecast. We have Rogers, Bell, TELUS in Canada. What do I do with my service providers? Patrick.
Great question. And we see a lot of customers come to us having attempted to use the DDoS mitigation services provided by their network. And I think the thing to keep in mind is what sort of level of control and visibility do you have over the process? Anytime we build a product, in the early days, it may be some human on the back end that's involved with configuring it, but we consider that a bug and something we temporarily need to work around. And so we want to give, as a network operator or security professional, we want to give that visibility in terms of both what traffic we're seeing, as well as the ability to control those mitigations or adjust the thresholds if maybe stuff is being mitigated that you did not want to be mitigated. And so I would have, in those conversations, I would have them, one, take you through what sort of control over the process do you have, how fast did it kick in from an SLA perspective. And so, you want something that a lot of these attacks come out of nowhere and maybe it will subside in 60 seconds, right? So if it takes a couple minutes for somebody to manually identify and block that, the damage is already done. And you can kind of test and vet those controls and that SLA to kick in with there's a bunch of companies out there that will make tools that they'll simulate tests against you. And so obviously you need to give them permission to do so. But running through real world scenarios like that and actually demonstrating that you can see it, that you can block it, and then that you can control it. Those are the three main things that I would recommend.
Yeah, I will add this though, Patrick, and I completely agree with you 100%. I do believe that, John, when you ask this question, having been in NOC environments and SOC environments, it does add another layer of complexity. And it is a resource. This is not something that, in my humble opinion, can be automated. You do need to orchestrate it, and you do need to orchestrate it with the human resource. I will also add this, that especially in critical infrastructure enterprise, during CISO Forum, we had conversations with some interesting folks, Kalyan Chakravarti, who was on the Cloudflare session, the CIO of the region of Durham, talking about things such as even going on tours of your telecom providers and seeing their SOC environments and just having that added layer of trust all ties in. People, process, technology, can have all the technology, all the process, but you need to have the people in place. So John, great question. And Patrick, as always, wonderful answer. Patrick,
sorry, I'll just add one thing to that. I think the other thing on that human element is the partners that we like to work with and the companies that consider us an extension of their team, like forging those relationships where there's that trust between companies, where if you're seeing something that a company is not, and knowing that you can get on the phone and talk to somebody to help debug it with you, and that's not going to get off the phone until you've actually got to the root of the problem, I think that's a critical aspect as well. So I didn't mean to skip over that, but I think that's truly important to forge that relationship at the human level too.
Very interesting, and thank you for that. Patrick, staying on this question of DDoS attacks, and before sort of setting the stage for our lovely bots to come into the picture, Patrick, I've often said this, that in security, you need to know what you do not know. And when it comes to DDoS attacks, at least, and again, the data that you provided is great. I've seen one comment come in, direct message to me, where somebody has asked, hey, can you share some of these reports and data sets? And yes, if the team from Cloudflare is listening, please drop these reports in the Cloudflare group on the Cyber Exchange platform. More importantly, for those who are watching this fantastic stream, just below, you're seeing ticker points with additional data points. All of that will be reflected in some of the white papers that you can get from Cloudflare. So thank you all for asking for that. Like I said, you need to know what you do not know. And when it comes to DDoS attacks, Patrick, one thing that I have noticed is, even in your report, it says that a lot of attacks now are coming in through non-traditional routes as well, like server logs, etc. Can you talk about these non-traditional routes where we typically don't tend to look? I mean, if I am experiencing a sudden spike in activity on my server, typically I might just not SSH in, and I'll attribute it to people logging into the platform at one single time. but I don't necessarily look at certain logs. I don't necessarily pull the top commands. Can you talk a little bit about these non-traditional areas where we're seeing DDoS attacks being executed?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually really a surprise to me. And this is something we learned in conversations with customers. So, they'll call us up and say, hey, I got this message and I want to be prepared for an attack. And we try to ask some information about it and refer them to authorities to report it. But one of the customers said, hey, I just found this out because I was looking at my HTTP request logs. I think it was Apache or Nginx. And all of a sudden there was, a URL requested that was hyphenated with, send Bitcoin to this address or else, you'd be DDoS.
Seen many of those. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you have to wonder, is that a genuine, legitimate request as well? Or is that somebody just trying to ride the coattails, if you will, of some of these attackers? And we have seen that too. We've seen groups purporting to be, Fancy Bear, Lazarus, some of these, very prolific attack groups. But I think the thing to keep in mind is, can you aggregate your logs somewhere that's easy to search through and have a holistic picture of what that is? And maybe there are certain patterns, regular expressions or ways to try to parse out some of those ransomware attacks. But these attackers are not picking up the phone and saying, hey, it's Joe, I'm going to launch an attack against you if you don't do this. They're trying to cover their tracks. And I think if you look probably at the source IP address of that request, it's likely routed through Tor or some sort of anonymization service. And so they're coming in non-traditional means. There's also coming in form filling on websites. And so, we use a company called Marketo to do a lot of our marketing forms, and, somebody going to fill that out there and putting in that detail instead of, going to the sales team to have a nice lead for them. It's actually getting them routed internally to the SOC or wherever that may get sent eventually.
Absolutely. And I think this is raising pretty interesting things when it comes to automation, but orchestration, orchestrate before you automate, but also in terms of visibility. And I'm a very big fan of this question that has just come in. And maybe it's a little premature to ask it, but I will nonetheless. And that is to do with visibility and metrics into the network. How easy is it, especially in enterprise environments, to integrate, and how interoperable is the Cloudflare stack with other tools I may be receiving data from Splunk, for example, or other EDRs or XDR systems that I have? How easy is it for Cloudflare stacks to be interoperable? A bit of a general question, but Patrick, your perspective.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it ties into the last point where if you want everything showing up in one location that's easy to search through and you can run some deeper analysis on. And so most of our larger customers, when they come on board, they'll configure some sort of real-time log push from our edge. And so they want to get both request logs to have a full picture of everything coming in at layer 7, but also security specific events, right? And so just a narrower stream that maybe gets routed to a security team. And so we've got integrations with all the SIMs that you would expect and all the logging platforms. And so we can push stuff to Splunk and Datadog and all the the typical players there. We're also able to push to whether it's like a Google Cloud bucket or AWS S3 or some sort of more just kind of block or object storage. And some folks have ETL processes downstream where they want to go through that data. I think the other thing to keep in mind too is how sensitive are those logs, and are there bits in there that you want to obfuscate or redact or encrypt in some particular way? And so in some cases, some of our financial services customers, in particular in the the credit card space or other payment space, will upload their own encryption key. And so we have this hybrid public key encryption where we can encrypt those payloads before they get pushed downstream, and that you don't want that data getting leaked, especially if it's some sort of payload that's posted and as part of an attack potentially, or maybe even a false positive. And so there's a security aspect in addition to where to push it. And then you mentioned at the top of the chat that we're a very global business, right? More than half of our businesses is outside the U.S. And so there's different regulatory frameworks that our customers have to work through. And so we're seeing a lot of interest, in particular in Europe and in Germany as well, in particular, where they say, okay, I only want these logs going to these specific locations, and I don't want them stored anywhere else, and I don't want them stored at all. And so there's a lot of concerns like that you need to think through.
Very interesting that you brought up the geographical piece, because there is a question, and I'm biting my lips because I need to get into the botnet conversation. You also mentioned something about financial sectors. I know there's a very interesting case study that we can piece apart as we go forward. We've got about 25 minutes left, so let's keep going as we are. But since you brought it up, I am a canned person, so I will take this question as well. Ellen says, slightly off topic, but Cloudflare has an impressive footprint. Yep. Are your customers bringing up any privacy or data localization concerns? Patrick, do you want to provide your 2 rupees of thought to that?
Sure. Yeah. And privacy is actually, if you talk to anybody at Cloudflare, people here are incredibly passionate about privacy. And we've released a lot of tools for not just for businesses, but for individuals at home. And so if you think about, you're in a coffee shop and your DNS request might be getting sent somewhere and monetized by your ISP, in particular in the US, that happens quite a bit. We make tools for free to hide those requests and encrypt them and try to give you that last mile privacy. And we continue to do things working with some of the browsers to provide some sort of private proxy where, again, your ISP can't snoop on you, and pushing things like TLS 1.3 where entire handshakes are encrypted and not just so you can't snoop on SNI and things like that. But yes, the concern is always there. And so what we've done is we've built our network in a very programmable way. And I think that drives a lot of the speed and velocity of our product, right? So the reason we're able to ship so frequently and have all these innovation weeks is we build using our own tools and components, right? We're in the midst of our serverless week right now, our full stack week, where we're giving these same tools that we use to ship products to our customers. And in particular on privacy and regulatory, there's a lot of, we have a product line called regional services where you may want to say, okay, I only want my IPs announced from European data centers, and I only want traffic routed here for decryption purposes, or I don't even want my private keys in these particular countries. I want, if a request comes in there, I want it routed somewhere else for that key handling operation. And so we've tried to build a very homogeneous network that can be programmable to those use cases. And it is especially as governments and regulatory bodies change their perspectives over time, it is a big focus for us. And so we'd love to talk more if there's specific privacy or other concerns. We'd love to follow up on that at some point.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I've always been a proponent of measure twice, cut once. And I think a lot of this also comes back onto the service users. I can, as a Cloudflare customer, on many of my digital assets, both personal and enterprise-wide, at least from the enterprise side, one of the things that comes up is those engagements that you have with the Patricks of the Cloudflares, and you have the Ash Mathurs, etc. Those conversations, asking those questions and stating very clearly what your requirements are. To Ellen, who asked that question, I'll also add that it's not just about privacy regulations as they apply from a geographical perspective, but also from a sector perspective. In the public sector, for example, we're governed by some different types of laws and requirements. The energy sector, the private sector especially, different requirements that kick in, and these requirements are constantly in a state of flux. I think one of the top things that I've seen in working with Cloudflare hasn't been about, hey, Cloudflare, what are you going to be doing about this? But instead coming with some suggestions and recommendations of how best to oblige by certain paradigms has been the right way to go. So security is not about vendors, it's about working with partners, and Cloudflare has definitely shown to a lot of us, at least in North America, how powerful they can be in creating those customized, not one-size-fits-all solutions. I think now it's time for me to go to the subject that my crowd has been waiting for. I hear them cheering in their own respective spaces. Let's go to the subject of botnets. Now, this shocked me, and I'm a professor in AI and computer science. I should have known this, but I don't. And Patrick shared with me that 40 to 50% of the internet traffic is generated by bots. Patrick, you've also made the statement that a good chunk of these are malicious. Whether we look at, you shared a story about a financial sector firm, I think it was a device, Microtronics, that was basically compromised and resulted in a pretty severe attack. What's driving this severe growth through this quarter in bot-driven and botnet attacks? Patrick, floor is yours.
Yeah, and just to kind of set the stage on some of the data, it was surprising to me as well. And we shared this out with some of our customers recently. And to the question earlier about where to find this data, we've got a great site called Cloudflare Radar, which we try to publish in real time. Some other companies put out kind of these static state of the internet reports, but we like to give it to you and let you slice and dice it, and constantly innovating there. So go check that out. The numbers, if you look back in the first half of 2020, was about 39% or so of global traffic that we saw was bot traffic, automated traffic. Look at the first half of this year, it was up to 44%. And even more worrisome, if you look at actually the login endpoints, it's closer to 70%, right? So we'll probably get to credential stuffing in a second. I can touch on that, but it's a large number. At first, my assumption was, hey, people are home at the with the pandemic early last year, moving to bored and trying to entertain themselves and launch these particular attacks. But it's really sustained. It's been as people have returned to work, it's been a continued trend that we're seeing. And really, like, if you have to think about what are the motivations as we come into the holiday season, for example, a lot of the bots we see, I'm not sure if you're, a sneakerhead or have particular sneakers that you like, but a lot of people.
Headphones, maybe.
Headphones,
AV equipment. Got a bit of
a
following there, but that's a separate story, separate discussion.
Yeah, maybe there's some big headphone drop coming, later this year, a brand new model. But a lot of these bots are really just inventory hoarding, trying to, again, think about the incentives. What is the financial incentive there for somebody to create a bot and drive that? So, people aren't buying stuff as much physically in stores. There's an increase in, e-commerce traffic. And if you think about trying to get that, whether it's a concert ticket or it's a new headphone or sneaker, and make a profit reselling it, right? A lot of people are programming bots, and so it's been kind of a bit of a fun arms race with those platforms. Additionally, there's if you can take over an account, right? The credential stuffing type of attack. What can you do with that account once you take it over? And so there's the obvious things, which may be, if it's a banking account, or, you can try to send a payment, you can try to take out a loan, you can try to do some sort of action with the authorization of that account. But what was surprising to me was actually the cases where, we work with a number of the food delivery companies. And so every time you're on your phone, making an order, that's most likely going through the Cloudflare network. And one of them told me that the reason to compromise the account was not to place an order for a cheeseburger or something and get it for free, but is really to exfiltrate that personal data to then leverage that in a different type of attack. And so somebody will send a bunch of authentication requests from a number of different sites, and they'll do so using credential databases that are freely available. And so if you go look around the internet now, they're not that hard to find. And I actually think that the ubiquity of these data sets is driving a lot of these attacks. There's toolkits out there you can download where you just feed it some data and try to start logging into accounts and taking over accounts. So I think a lot of those trends are, or a lot of those dynamics are increasing that trend of what's automated. Additionally, there's really sophisticated attacks we're seeing too, which aren't volumetric in nature. It's not like you're trying to consume too many of the resources, or knock an API offline, or take it down, or break into an account. It's, you have an account, maybe you've created it on your own as a legitimate account at the outset, but then you're trying to kind of walk through an API. And so again, just to go back to the example of the ordering food online, we've seen customers have their suspicion is that a competitor is loading that up in an emulator, loading their app up, and then walking their APIs and maybe grabbing a list of all the restaurants and all the prices they charge as competitive information. And so we've had to move from just like looking at basic attributes, is this a stolen credential, to what is the probability that you move from one API state to another, and then to another, and then trying to kind of surface those needles in the haystack.
Yeah, and I'm going to add a little bit of note to this, is that even, for example, when we train graduate students in AI and in writing Python scripts, so on and so forth, using bots, especially for scraping or for parsing the web, is very, very common. So as these skill sets become very common, as they become very automated, you can pull libraries to write this stuff. We see a lot of folks wanting to write a script to click on the latest shoe when it gets released and buy it and purchase it, so on and so forth. It does release a pretty dangerous tool out into the market that can be used pretty badly by adversaries. Now, I want to take a question that's come in with relation to botnets. And I've always maintained that the worst place to be is in the middle, because when elephants are fighting, it's the grass that gets trampled. And you kind of don't want to be in the middle as a company providing a service when you've been struck by a botnet attack. But botnet attacks can also provide a layer of invisibility. How do companies and organizations deal with botnet attacks from a law enforcement perspective? Is this something that they can even report to law enforcement? How have you seen law enforcement deal with some of these attacks when reported, especially when the attack routes or the people behind the attack are hidden behind machines?
Great question. And just to put a pin in your last point about legitimate bots, someone who may write, I've, as a former software developer, I've written my own fair share of bots. And, when my parents were trying to get the COVID vaccine, there was this awful 7-step website that, was impossible for them to navigate. They're 70 years old and were struggling to it. And so I wrote a bot to kind of blast through that. Fortunately, before they deployed, a couple of days before they deployed the Cloudflare bot mitigation, I would have had a harder task in my hands. But there's a lot of good bots out there. And if you are writing a good bot in the audience and you want to make sure that that bot's able to access data behind Cloudflare, we've got a verified bot program. And so you can submit, the legitimate use case for your bot, where it's coming from, how we can identify it. And, we can make sure that it doesn't get treated the same way as malicious bots. So definitely let us know if that's something you're working on. On the question you just asked about the botnets and what you can do about them in law enforcement, the challenge is that you can't go and take a list of, here's the 37,218 IPs that hit us and made these requests. Even if it is something where you've completed a TCP handshake and it's not spoofed. Because a lot of those are just devices that are, that are in people's homes that they're not aware of being used. To go back to the Maris botnet earlier, that actually started out doing DDoS, right? There was a proxy open on these MikroTik routers, and they were used to just send a high volume of requests. But those actually shifted to attempted fraud using bots. And so some sort of malicious requests or attempt to log in. And so you can go to law enforcement, and you should, if you've had some sort of attack that you've seen, and provide them all the logs that you can, and we can help you export logs and things like that. But they're not able to necessarily go and nor should they for somebody that doesn't even know that they're involved in this and take action. Really, what you have to do is get at the root of the attackers. And so you see companies like Microsoft publish a lot about going after botnets and taking down the underlying threat actors. And so that's really typically the way to go after the source of it, but then also just writing more secure software, right? Trying to patch your devices and making sure that you're running the latest. Don't dismiss that nag in the top right, of your computer when it tells you it needs to update, right? The same way you should be updating firmware on your devices. And so really, I think it's the job of this industry and this ecosystem to help build more secure software by default.
I want to work with that just a little bit more, because I do know that in our audience, and only because I invited them, I know, for example, we have the CEO online from Connects Health, a growing startup in our region that provides pharmaceutical deliveries, that provides PSW services online. And this has been an industry that has been targeted quite a lot because they have medical data. And botnets have been a frequent, and they use Cloudflare as well, a frequent source of attack. So their CEO, Meda, sent me a question. And that is, appreciating your insight. And I'll frame the question just a little bit, Meda, with your permission. I'm assuming I have it. One of the things that I've always said is, the good people will learn from their own mistakes. The great ones learn from the mistakes of others. And one of the mistakes that Meda has been noticing is many of her peers in a similar sector, when it comes to targeting or dealing with bots and botnets, they assume that CAPTCHA is probably their only strongest line of defense, and innovations in CAPTCHA are probably the only way in which you can protect. Can you give some perspective on that and explain to them how that's probably just your first starting point when it comes to understanding how to protect against botnets? Patrick?
Yeah, great question. And for those that don't know what CAPTCHAs are, I think most of you have probably experienced them, but it's typically probably the most common example is Google's reCAPTCHA, where it pops up and you've got these boxes and you're asked to identify, pick something out, typically to give Google free labor to train their machine learning models, right?
Pretty much.
For self-driving cars. I think there's a funny XKCD comic, something to the effect of like, click all the photos where you run for shelter during a robot uprising, as a very tongue-in-cheek joke there. But CAPTCHAs are great on the one hand because they're difficult for computers to solve. Obviously, there's CAPTCHA farms, but they're not great because they're difficult sometimes for humans, right? And they may be, if you have a very, very high confidence that something is malicious or a bot, you maybe want to serve it, and the results of that actually gets fed back into our machine learning models. But really, it's not something you want users to have to do. And so you want users to be able to demonstrate that they are legitimate in a way that is unobtrusive to them, a way that they don't actually have to take action and slow down what they're trying to do. And so you've seen a lot of advancements, and we're working on this where you can serve challenges. So we have a team internally known as the No CAPTCHA team, and their mission is to drive, the percent of CAPTCHAs we serve down to 0 over time. And they're doing things that are really sophisticated challenges, typically on the JavaScript side, where they're actually monitoring a lot of these tools on GitHub and watching the issues as people report us breaking their malicious bots. And it's kind of funny. We'll sit on these and figure out, okay, they got by this challenge, and there's a whole bunch more waiting for them, and trying to assess, how far they'll get. But the idea there is essentially that that request is given some sort of work that only a human-driven computer essentially can do, but it's transparent to the end user, and so they're not clicking on things or taking their time out of their day. Additionally, I think there's things where if if you know for sure or very high likelihood it's a malicious bot, you can waste that bot's time, right? You can start returning it the wrong prices, or making it think that it's put something in a shopping cart that it really hasn't. And so there's a lot of different techniques and things that we are working on in particular. At the same time, like APIs are not a good, CAPTCHAs are not good for APIs, right? What is a mobile device or a curl client going to do, when a JavaScript blog comes back to try to execute JavaScript? And so I think using the right mitigation tool for the right request type is really important. And this is a big area of investment and focus for us, and excited to talk about this more on our blog, where we announce stuff. We've announced a bit of early work on things like device attestation, always a hard word to say, where you can, if you've got a device, a mobile phone in particular, that can demonstrate that it is actual legitimate device, that has a higher trust than some sort of generic client that maybe doesn't have that same level of assurance. And so there's a lot of different fronts here, and we're excited to keep working on them.
Fantastic. And I know that this is a subject that a lot of folks have been pinging us about, especially at CISO Forum. We had quite a few small to medium business owners that came out with their one-person IT team, in some cases, looking at how to deploy some cost-effective solutions. So I do recommend to all those who are on. I see Ash from Ash Mathur from Cloudflare is on. Patrick's here as well. Jillian's on as well from Cloudflare. Feel free to reach out. I do see a trend for a future session on Cloudflare deployments for small to medium enterprise, and that's something that we'll certainly look into going forward. We've got about 12 more minutes to go. And Patrick, I want to stay on the topic of automation just for a little bit longer, and then talk a little about credential stuffing. And if possible, if we have time to decode our favorite subject, which is our API-friendly internet world, web applications, and JavaScript-based deployment. So let's try and rush through that in 12 minutes. I've always said, Patrick, you got to fight fire with fire, and you attested to that point in your previous comment as well. How are you integrating machine learning and automation into your Cloudflare shields and stacks that you provide your clients? If you can take 2 minutes and summarize that for us.
Sure. And so, for those that aren't aware, that the machine learning models get better with data over time, right? The more data and outcomes of that data that you're confident in, that you can feed into these models, the better these models become. And so we think about a couple of years ago when we started developing some of our early, first generation machine learning models for our bot mitigation, they were not as good at discerning legitimate versus illegitimate requests. We released our 5th generation not too long ago, and really there's the result of that is and that's a result rather of all the data that we fed into it. And so we have a bot product that historically was just sold to our larger customers. But even that being the case, every request, so those 28 million on average requests per second that pass through, every single one of those is scored and fed into the model. So even if somebody is not utilizing our bot mitigation product, their traffic is helping make the system better. And so that's really what we've been focused. And then of course, looking at different attributes and feeding in different dimensions into the model over time and expanding the types of things you look at. And then more specifically, being able to build models that are specific to a particular customer. And so it may be the case that the request looks anomalous across all of our traffic, but maybe that customer just has those types of requests. And so you don't want to falsely trigger on something that for them is normal and legitimate. And so learning what their traffic patterns are and then adjusting the defenses to their patterns is really important that you do.
Yeah, and I think what's really, really important is, I was reading this about the application layer attacks and how the Cloudflare model works. There are a couple of stages in terms of how you isolate those IP ranges or isolate where the attacks are coming from. There's a first stage which looks at the ingress traffic, a second stage which doesn't just look at, all right, we see things are normal. They could still be some malicious actors that have already gotten through your defenses. And how do you continue maintaining that your proactive security posture? So I think it's really, really important for our audience. If you have the chance or you have questions and you want demos of some of the tool stacks, reach out to the team at Cloudflare, because I think you do need to see how some of these products are operationalized. And there's a particular reason why a good chunk of the internet traffic in the world is about a millisecond away from an edge from Cloudflare. And they've got pretty interesting insights there. Patrick, 2 more questions. And I saw this come up twice, and I expected this. Some of the aspects of your report have talked about credential stuffing as growing increasingly, and you're seeing more trends of this in a variety of sectors. And if I'm not mistaken, you've even pointed out the financial sector, made mention to crypto, so on and so forth. Credential stuffing, why is this becoming, or why is this growing in its menace to the community?
Yeah, I think it's growing because it's easier to do, right? The costs are lower to mount this. The databases, you've probably seen, Troy Hunt's Have I Been Pwned website. You hopefully have not gotten too many emails from him indicating your credentials have been leaked, but that's happening, more and more frequently. Where again, back to insecure applications, somebody's database of credentials, maybe they're hashed using some weak hashing algorithm. They can be brute forced. Maybe they're not hashed at all, and they're just dumped in plain text. But those are everywhere. Those are easy to get. There's companies that sell these databases as their main business model. Legitimate companies that sell them to security companies, they may utilize them, but who knows where that data goes and who has access to it. And so it's easier to do from a data perspective. The advantage you do when you take over an account, right? As more and more stuff moves, and I know we'll probably talk about APIs after, as more stuff moves to functional things that you can do online that historically had to be done in person, there's just more incentive and surface area and reward to actually take over an account. The other, there's a more subtle, not an account takeover per se, but an account misuse. I may or may not have shared, my Netflix login with a few of my friends, and Netflix, maybe is okay with that. And I know they give you a certain number of devices, but there are other companies that sell APIs, access to things, or front-end access to things, where their license is very strict in terms of what you can and can't do. And so we've seen people want to know, not just, is this account, are these credentials exposed somewhere and somebody compromised the account, but are these credentials being shared and violating, terms of service or licensing that they have to enforce because of some, contractual relationships they have with their partners. And so being able to tell people, hey, this account is logged in from, 3 different countries, with 3 different types of browsers, or this account previously was logging in from a residential ISP, and then now all of a sudden is coming from behind a virtual private server or something, and whether it's DigitalOcean or wherever, those are signals that people want to know, and not just the account was compromised, but it came in from behind a VPN service, for example. That may be a signal or an indicator of compromise for somebody that they want to actually look into, is there something problematic with this account?
Thank you for that. Another 2 more minutes to go before we come to a soft landing. And
Sure.
I do want to continue the I see one question, direct message to me as well, around passwordless authentication. And what does that mean to the world of credentials, and how is Cloudflare preparing for that reality? Are those inherently 100% safe? I can tell you no, but it certainly creates a new risk matrix, which we can discuss at another time. APIs. We normally write software not to work independently, but to work with other software. You know the drill. You've been in the DevOps space. From a DevSecOps perspective, you've highlighted in this report that, along with your colleagues, that, what is it, 67% of code that you're seeing is written in JavaScript. My Git repo would concur with that. Lots of JavaScript libraries that are floating around our applications, mediating some of our API calls. Can you comment a little bit about what Cloudflare is seeing in trends as it relates to DevOps when it comes to JavaScript, as well as API integrations? Your perspective, Patrick.
Sure. And quick point on the passwordless stuff. Everybody at Cloudflare has issued a hard key that plugs in. And I think the strongest thing is, knowing something and then having something that you can't be phished, like a time-based one-time password. And so if I want to get to any resource internally, if I don't have that physical key on me, I'm not able to get in. And that's been a big boost. And I strongly encourage you internally to roll those out. So jumping into JavaScript and API, everybody wants to build software fast, right? And to do that, you need to rely on third parties. And so that may be a third-party API you're calling, or maybe a third-party, JavaScript file that you're pulling into your web page. On the JavaScript side, there's a lot of risk there. We actually looked at our customer networks and saw, customers' applications, and saw the average application used over 100 JavaScript files. That was kind of crazy to me. I did not think it would be that high. It's been a long time since I've written a web application. Was quite
fast development, fast demands, yeah, for sure.
Exactly. And so I think beyond that, though, the really scary thing is that those JavaScript files are changing almost on a daily basis. I think 13% of the customers we saw, they're adding new scripts every 24 hours. And that's already disambiguating the randomly generated file names or URL paths that we do, for example, on our own blog. And then, if you look at on a weekly basis, I think it's a third actually are introducing new JavaScript. And so you got to stay on top of that supply chain risk, and you need to monitor those changes and flag them and take a look. And to the machine learning model point earlier, we're actually trying to evaluate that change in JavaScript and see, is it a potentially malicious change, so you don't get hit by a mage cart-like attack. On the API side, there's a big shift from it used to be the SOAP XMLs, and then it was JSON and RESTful calls. Yeah. Now we're seeing more gRPC and binary. We have customers telling us, hey, I want to move entirely to gRPC. And so how do you actually build and enforce a positive security model there? Can you throw away requests that don't match your schema files? And can you do that both for RESTful JSON calls as well as gRPC? And so how do you eliminate that noise and then put in strong authentication, so the only thing that ends up on your application is something you want to see? And that's where we spend a lot of time thinking about, is how do we give those controls to not only protect against it, but then surface them in the first place, because you see people that are spinning up APIs. Developers want to build things quickly, and sometimes those get exposed before the security team has had a chance to lock them down.
Yeah, and again, I think this when we were discussing this prior to this session, we talked about DevOps and DevSecOps, and that's a subject in and of itself that we could spend a couple of very powerful power hours on. And Patrick, since you do have a DevOps background, it would be very interesting to bring on a couple of other folks as well to see how they're factoring that into their development. One of the things that I can share from a personal anecdote is, we often, when we're developing, especially quick applications, we look at some basic Cloudflare deployments that we can integrate with. But I think point our DNS service in the right directions, etc. Have CloudFront at the front, CDNs. But I think there's also an opportunity to discuss how to think about some Cloudflare stacks and technologies while you're actually writing code. And these are very, very interesting moments for developers. And I highly, highly recommend that as a separate subject, hopefully at another time. Patrick, we have come to the last minute of these very powerful 60 minutes. And I'm going to give you 10 seconds. What do they say? That the eyes are the windows to the soul or something like that. But I think the same can be said about books. If there's a book that has inspired you and you'd like to recommend to our audience, which book would that be?
Yeah, that's a great question. And something I had not read when I started at Cloudflare, but as I heard our CEO, Matthew Prince, speak and describe sort of the origins of the company and where we started and how we need to stay ahead and disrupt ourselves. Clayton Christensen, Innovator's Dilemma, is something I'd highly encourage folks to read if they haven't. Professor at HBS for a long time, and just really talking about, if how you come up with a disrupting technology, and when you release it, it's not quite able to satisfy the needs of the market, but being able to continually innovate and move upwards and over time be good enough for the target audience. And that for me is really powerful book, and we internalize that at Cloudflare quite a bit.
Patrick, very well spoken, and the Cloudflare brand bleeds right through everything that you say. I can see exactly why you were the top recommendation for this Power Hour. It's been an honor, and I'm humbled to have spent time with you. Patrick, there were quite a few questions that came in, and I'll make sure that, I think we've answered all of them, but for those that didn't get answered, I'll make sure to have them connected with you. Patrick, I want to ask you to stay on while I bid the audience adieu so that you and I can have a quick 30-second powwow in the green room. But before I bid the audience adieu, once again, Patrick, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your expertise, and it was a pleasure hosting you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Perfect. And to our audience, if you want to get in touch with the awesome team from Cloudflare, reach out to them on the Cyber Exchange platform. You can even go to their group. I believe they have some prizes there as well, a really fancy Bluetooth, which I was hoping to win, but I did not. We will have separate conversations about that. But there's so much to learn from their team, and I advise you and I encourage you to reach out with them. I know that my team, especially the folks from the region of Durham, who I did a session with, and other organizations like Sobeys, etc., all excited to speak to Cloudflare, because there's a lot that can be offered at the edge and also to your internal development work. Very exciting times. I encourage all of you to engage with them. I always close the Power Hour by talking about something that I learned. And I think today, I learned a lot about this. There's data, but data is useless if you don't have insights. And the way in which Patrick uncovered insights from that data, there's a lot for all of us to learn from that. When you're thinking about security strategy, I often hear companies tell me, oh, what do I do? What do I do? Today, Patrick reminded me of much about security is about what not to do. So keep that in mind and put that on a t-shirt the next time you are in your meetings when it comes to security. And oh yes, I will also say this, that security strategies are very beautiful, but once in a while, you do need to look at the results and have those hard conversations, as Cloudflare just demonstrated. Stay safe, stay well. I'll see you next week for another session of the Power Hour. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you again, Cloudflare, for making this happen, along with the awesome team from Cyber Exchange. Everybody, enjoy the rest of your day.